Margaret Lawson stood before the cabin like a woman arriving at her own funeral. The deed in her right hand had gone soft from sweat, and December cold, its crisp courthouse folds reduced to something resembling tissue paper. Her left hand hung empty at her side, the ring finger pale where a gold band had pressed its shape into her skin for 4 decades, a ghost of a circle, a tan line in reverse proof that something had been there long enough to leave a mark even after it was gone. Behind her, the sedan ticked and cooled in the mountain air, stuffed with garbage bags full of clothing and a single box of photographs she had not yet been brave enough to open. Before her, the structure sagged against the Blue Ridge sky like a drunk leaning on a lamppost. Logs splitting at the joints, a porch collapsed on one side like a broken jaw. Windows punched out and staring. The wind moved through the gaps in the walls and the cabin groaned. And if Margaret had been a woman who believed in signs, she might have said the place was breathing. The man she had loved for 40 years had laughed when he handed her this piece of paper. He had called it a gesture of goodwill. His lawyer had smirked. The woman half his age had been waiting in his car outside the courthouse, probably checking her phone, probably not thinking about Margaret at all, because why would she? He had given Margaret this place the way a man tosses a crumpled napkin toward a trash can. Careless, already looking elsewhere, confident it would land where forgotten things land. He did not know what was hidden behind these rotting walls. He did not know that his arrogance had handed her the key to everything. But that revelation was still weeks away, buried in cedar and oilcloth, and the handwriting of a dead man. On this December afternoon, Margaret Lawson knew only that she was 62 years old, that she was alone, and that the cabin smelled like something had died inside it. Which, in a manner of speaking, something had. Her old life, her old self. The woman who had spent 4 decades believing that devotion was the same thing as identity. But that is getting ahead of the story. To understand the woman standing in front of this ruin, you have to go back 3 months to a morning in late August, to a kitchen that smelled like fresh coffee, to a house so clean it looked like a photograph of itself. 3 weeks past her 62nd birthday, Margaret Lawson moved through the kitchen of her Richmond home the way water moves through a familiar riverbed, without thought, without friction, following the channel carved by 40 years of repetition. Coffee at 6:15. Counters wiped before the pot finished brewing. The newspaper separated into sections: business and sports set at Douglas's place. The rest recycled because he never read anything else. And she had stopped pretending she had time for the crossword. Breakfast planned, lunch prepped, dinner already mapped in her head. Salmon roasted asparagus, that lemon butter sauce he used to compliment but now consumed in silence, scrolling through his phone between bites. The house was immaculate. It was always immaculate. 4,000 square feet of suburban perfection in Richmond's West End, every surface reflecting 40 years of a woman's invisible labor. The hardwood floors gleamed because Margaret refinished them every spring. The windows were spotless because she cleaned them monthly, inside and out, standing on a stepladder at 62 with a squeegee and a bucket of vinegar water. The gardens were a minor neighborhood legend. Azaleas, hydrangeas, climbing roses trained along the fence with the patience of someone who understood that beautiful things required years of unseen work. Visitors often complimented Douglas on the house. He accepted their praise with a nod, the way a man accepts credit for the weather on a day he planned an outdoor party. Margaret had been 20 years old when she met Douglas Lawson at a university mixer. She, a third-year architecture student with graphite-stained fingers and a sketchbook full of impossible buildings, he, a business major, with a jaw like a promise and the kind of confidence that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. She remembered the first drawing she showed him: a public library with a cantilevered reading room suspended over a reflecting pool, every line precise, every angle earned. He had studied it with genuine attention, which was more than most men offered. And then he had smiled and said something she would carry for decades. You see things other people walk past. She had fallen in love not with the compliment, but with the implication that he saw her seeing. They married at 22, Nathan arrived at 23, and Margaret's drafting table migrated from the center of their tiny apartment to a corner, then to a closet. then to the bottom of a storage unit she paid for with grocery money. Douglas never audited. He had not forced her to quit. He had simply presented a logic that seemed airtight at the time his career was ascending. The baby needed a full-time parent. Her income as a junior draftsman would barely cover childcare. Why struggle when he could provide? You don't need the degree, he had told her, his hand on her belly, where Nathan was kicking, his voice warm, certain, generous. I'll take care of everything. She had believed him. 40 years later, rolled inside a tube of yellowed paper stored beneath spare bed linens in the guest room closet. The library with the cantilevered reading room still waited. Margaret touched that tube sometimes the way a person touches a scar, not to reopen it, just to confirm it was real, that the wound had once been there, that the girl who drew impossible buildings had once existed. Claire arrived 4 years after Nathan, and Margaret's world contracted further into the geometry of motherhood and household management. She became expert in the architecture of other people's needs. Douglas's client dinners requiring precise table settings and the right wines, and conversation that made his partners feel important, while she faded into the backdrop Nathan's soccer schedules and college applications, and the quiet crisis of his sophomore year that she navigated alone because Douglas was closing a deal in Norfolk. Claire's piano recitals and broken hearts, and the fierce independence that Margaret admired and envied in equal measure. She managed everything so that Douglas could focus on the only thing that seemed to matter, building his commercial real estate empire, one strip mall and office park at a time. Her mother, dead 10 years now, had understood something Margaret hadn't. Ruth Calloway had raised 4 daughters alone after her husband walked out in 1971, working double shifts at the textile mill in Danville, Virginia, never remarrying, never softening, never apologizing for the calluses on her hands or the steel in her voice. Ruth had a saying she repeated to her girls like a prayer or a warning, and Margaret could still hear it in her mother's Piedmont drawl, clipped and certain. Baby girl, the strongest tree is the one that grows from rock. Margaret had nodded politely every time and privately thought the saying didn't apply to her. She wasn't growing from rock. She had Douglas. She had good soil. She had the house with the gleaming floors and the prize-winning azaleas. The signs had been there for months, maybe longer. Douglas's evenings at the office stretching past 10, his explanations growing shorter as his absences grew longer. A new cologne that smelled like something a younger man would wear, sharp, aggressive, deliberately modern. The gym membership he had never wanted suddenly producing visible results in his arms and chest at 64. As if his body were auditioning for a role his marriage had not cast him in. Business trips to Charlotte and Raleigh that multiplied through the spring and summer, each one requiring a new suit, a new shirt, a carry-on bag Margaret had not purchased. She noticed these things the way she noticed a slow leak in the roof, with concern, but also with the assumption that the structure was fundamentally sound. 40 years of marriage built a foundation of trust, didn't it? 40 years of showing up, of cooking and cleaning and raising children and entertaining clients and sleeping beside the same man and growing old alongside him. That meant something. That was bedrock. You didn't abandon bedrock because of a new cologne and some late nights. The morning everything ended began like any other. August heat pressing against the windows, coffee brewing. The newspapers separated. Margaret was planning dinner. Salmon, asparagus, lemon butter. When Douglas came downstairs in a suit she had never seen. Dark blue, slim-cut, tailored in a way that suggested someone with different taste had chosen it. She noticed the tie first, a narrow silk knot in a pattern she did not recognize. In 40 years, Margaret had selected every tie Douglas owned. She knew his closet the way a librarian knows her shelves. This tie was a foreign object catalogued by someone else's hand. It should have been a small detail. It wasn't. His jaw was set. His eyes were aimed at a point slightly to the left of her face, as though he were addressing a difficult client rather than the woman who had shared his bed for 14,000 nights. "We need to talk." Margaret's stomach dropped the way it does when an elevator descends too fast. Not pain exactly, but the sudden awareness that the ground is no longer where you expected it to be. She knew the tone. 40 years had taught her to read Douglas Lawson the way a sailor reads the sky, and this sky was black. They sat in the living room. The room Margaret had decorated and redecorated across 4 decades, the wallpaper she chose in 1986, the hardwood she had refinished in 2003, the mantel where she had arranged family photographs in a sequence that told the story of her life. Christmas mornings and birthday parties. Nathan's first steps near the coffee table. Claire at the piano, age 9, playing a Bach minuet with the concentration of a surgeon. Margaret and Douglas at their 30th anniversary dinner, her in green silk, him with his arm around her. Both of them smiling in the way that long-married couples smile, not with the electricity of new love, but with the steady warmth of something that was supposed to last. Douglas sat across from her, not beside her. 6 feet of carpet between them, a distance wider than any he had maintained in 4 decades of marriage. He chose the armchair. She was on the sofa. The arrangement was deliberate, and the deliberateness was its own kind of violence. He was positioning himself for departure, not conversation. "I want a divorce." The words arrived flat, rehearsed, stripped of everything except information. "I've met someone. Her name is Sloane. She's 31. Margaret felt each sentence land like a stone thrown at glass, the first crack the spiderweb spreading the moment before everything shatters. His hand gripped the arm of the chair, knuckles white, and she saw it, a flicker of hesitation, a single second, where his jaw unclenched and something almost human passed behind his eyes. He knew this was wrong. He knew what he was doing to her. The hesitation was worse than cruelty, because it proved he still had a conscience. It just wasn't strong enough to stop him. He had weighed 40 years of marriage against whatever Sloane made him feel, and the marriage had come up short. The conscience flickered and died like a pilot light in a draft. "She makes me feel alive again, feel young, feel vital." Margaret's voice barely held together, the words escaping like air from a punctured tire. "She's our daughter's age, Doug. Maggie, look at yourself." He leaned forward, and now he did look at her. And the looking was worse than the avoidance, because his eyes swept over her, the way a man surveys a property he's decided not to buy. "You're 62. You've let yourself go. You've become invisible. I've provided for you the house, the cars, this life. All of it. I've worked for 40 years. Now I want to live for myself." Provided. The word landed like a slap. As if 40 years of managing his household, raising his children, sacrificing her career, entertaining his clients, maintaining his home, keeping his world running so smoothly that he never once had to think about grocery lists or parent-teacher conferences, or whether the gutters needed cleaning, as if all of that was a line item that rounded to zero. Margaret looked down at her hands, the hands that had cooked 30,000 meals, washed 40,000 loads of laundry, held 2 babies through fevers and nightmares, arranged 10,000 place settings for his business dinners, refinished floors, cleaned windows, pruned roses. These hands had built an entire world so that Douglas Lawson could walk through it without friction, and he had just appraised them at no financial value. "I want you out by the end of the week. My lawyer will be in touch." He stood. He walked out. No embrace, no handshake, no backward glance. 40 years terminated in under 10 minutes. The front door closed with the careful click of a man who was already thinking about what came next, and what came next did not include her. Margaret sat alone in the living room she had built, and felt something fundamental shift inside her, like a foundation cracking beneath a house everyone assumed was solid. She reached for her left hand and twisted the wedding ring, a reflex, a habit the way a person touches a rosary. Then she pulled it off. The skin beneath was white, indented, a groove worn by 4 decades of gold against flesh. She held the ring in her palm, did not throw it, did not put it on the counter, slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan, where it sat heavy and small like a tooth knocked loose. She wasn't ready to discard it, wasn't ready to keep it. It occupied a limbo that matched her own. The months between August and November unfolded like a slow-motion demolition. Douglas's legal team, 3 lawyers from a firm whose offices occupied an entire floor of a building. He had developed, dismantled Margaret's 40-year contribution to the marriage with the precision of accountants and the empathy of machines. Every asset was attributed to Douglas's income, Douglas's career, Douglas's professional labor. The house purchased with his earnings, the cars his money, the retirement accounts his industry, his risk his reward. Margaret Lawson had been a homemaker. She had contributed no financial value. The phrase appeared in legal documents with the sterility of a medical diagnosis, as though raising 2 children and managing a 4,000 square foot household for 4 decades was a hobby she had pursued for personal amusement. Her court-appointed attorney, a woman named Deborah, who was competent and compassionate and hopelessly outgunned, did her best. She filed motions arguing equitable contribution. She cited precedent. She prepared testimony about the economic value of household labor, the career sacrifices Margaret had made, the enabling role she had played in Douglas's professional success. But she was one lawyer against 3 operating on a public defender's budget, against a team whose billable hours could have funded a small nonprofit. The outcome was never really in doubt. Nathan called every week, careful, and measured a 42-year-old man trying to love both parents without betraying either. He asked how she was doing. He offered his spare bedroom. But Margaret heard the pause before the offer, the slight tightening in his voice that said he had already discussed it with his wife, that the invitation came with an expiration date and conditions. Claire called more often, but with a bluntness that cut in its own way. "Mom, you need to get a lawyer who actually fights." Margaret did not explain that she couldn't afford a lawyer who actually fights, that the money she had access to was a savings account. Douglas didn't know about a few $1,000s accumulated over decades from the margins of grocery budgets deposited in small amounts into an account she opened when Nathan started college, not from deception, but from some instinct she hadn't known she possessed. The instinct of a woman who understood on a level below conscious thought that she might someday need money that belonged only to her. The final hearing fell on a gray November morning. The courthouse in Richmond smelled like floor wax and anxiety. Margaret sat on her side of the aisle with Deborah. Douglas sat on his with his legal team, 3 men in suits that cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget for a year. Sloane was not present, her absence a strategic choice or a personal one. Margaret didn't know, and found she didn't care. But she noticed as Douglas removed his overcoat and draped it across the bench, a trace of perfume rising from the fabric. Something floral and sharp, younger than anything Margaret had ever worn. Sloane's ghost clinging to his collar. The judge read through the settlement with the efficiency of a man who had seen 1,000 marriages reduced to columns of numbers. Douglas retained the house, the vehicles, the majority of retirement accounts. Margaret would receive monthly alimony for 5 years. The judge called it sufficient time for Mrs. Lawson to establish independent footing. As though 62-year-old women, discarded after 4 decades of domestic service, simply established footing the way a gymnast sticks a landing. Then, almost as an afterthought, Douglas's lead attorney cleared his throat. "There is one additional property, a cabin on 20 acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains, inherited by Mr. Lawson from his late father. The structure has been abandoned for approximately 20 years. No functional utilities, no commercial value. We propose deeding the property to Mrs. Lawson as a gesture of goodwill." Douglas leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. Both men smiled, the particular smile of people sharing a joke at someone else's expense. Margaret looked at Deborah. Deborah looked back with an expression that was half apology and half question. There was nothing else to negotiate. The column of numbers had been tallied. Margaret's 40 years had been weighed and found wanting by every metric the court recognized. "Fine," she whispered. Outside the courtroom, Deborah pulled Margaret aside in the hallway, glancing at her notes with a frown that suggested she'd found something that bothered her professional conscience. I checked the property records for that cabin. The deed lists 22 acres, not 15. Their filing says 15. They either didn't verify or they didn't care enough to get it right. She paused. 7 extra acres won't change your life, but it tells you something about how carefully they evaluated what they were giving away. Margaret nodded. 7 acres. Douglas's team had been so certain the property was worthless that they hadn't even measured it correctly. Arrogance, she thought. The same arrogance that made him believe 40 years of her labor amounted to nothing. The same arrogance that would in time cost him far more than 7 acres. But she didn't know that yet. She heard his voice behind her as she walked toward the exit. Enjoy the cabin, Maggie. Try not to let it collapse on you. His laugh echoed against the marble. Margaret kept walking, through the glass doors across the parking lot into her sedan. She turned the key pull to the far corner of the lot and parked beneath a bare maple tree. Then she broke. Not the dramatic collapse of movies, no screaming, no pounding the steering wheel. Just a quiet dissolution, tears sliding down her face in the steady, noiseless way of rain on a window. She cried until her chest ached. She pulled the ring from her cardigan pocket, held it under the grey November light, then returned it to the pocket. Not ready. 62 years old, divorced, nearly destitute, and the owner of a piece of land her ex-husband had given her as a punchline. The last week in the house was an exercise in compression, 40 years squeezed into a sedan. Margaret moved through the rooms with the methodical grief of someone packing up after a death, which in some ways she was. Clothing into garbage bags. Photograph albums into a box she taped shut because opening it would have stopped her entirely. A few pieces of furniture from before the marriage, a rocking chair that had been her mother's. A small writing desk she'd bought at an estate sale the year she and Douglas got engaged. She walked through the kitchen last. Her fingertips traced the granite countertop and found the scratch, a jagged line near the edge where Nathan, age 4, had dragged a metal toy truck across the surface. She had been furious at the time, had made him sit in the corner for 15 minutes, had buffed the scratch with mineral oil, had worried Douglas would notice. He never did. Now she stood over that scratch and wanted to pry it from the stone and carry it with her. This tiny record of a Tuesday afternoon 28 years ago when her son was small and the house was hers and the future was a thing she trusted. But the counter stayed. The scratch stayed. Everything stayed for Douglas and Sloane. The neighbors were kind in the way of people who have witnessed a car accident and feel obligated to slow down. Carol from across the street brought a casserole. Jim next door offered to help load the car. But kindness had a half-life and divorce was radioactive. Some had already heard Douglas's version that Margaret had let herself go, had become boring, had failed to keep up with a man who was still vital and ambitious. These neighbors nodded sympathetically while privately calculating their allegiances, and most of them calculated in Douglas's favor because Douglas was still in the neighborhood and Margaret was leaving. Nathan called on her final night. "Mom, the spare room is ready. Sarah put fresh sheets on the bed. Stay as long as you need." Margaret heard it the micro-pause before. As long as you need, Ahoaso. The way the phrase floated upward at the end like a question rather than a statement. She heard Sarah's voice in the background muffled something about the kid's schedule. Her son loved her. Her daughter-in-law tolerated her. The spare room would become a pressure point within weeks, and everyone in the conversation knew it. "I have the cabin. I'm going to stay there for a while, figure things out." Claire was less diplomatic when she called an hour later. "Mom, that place is a dump. Dad called it condemned." "Then it'll suit me perfectly." The bitterness leaked through before Margaret could stop it, and she heard her mother's voice in the silence that followed Ruth Calloway's Piedmont rasp. "Cutting through the decades, the strongest tree is the one that grows from rock." Margaret had never understood that saying. She had never needed to. She had always had good soil, or thought she had. Dawn came early on the first day of December, and Margaret loaded the last of her bags. The sedan sat low on its springs, heavy with the compressed weight of a life. She placed the rolled tube of architectural drawings, her library, her cantilevered reading room, her impossible buildings on the passenger seat. She did not know why she'd kept them all these years. Sentiment, maybe. Stubbornness. The refusal to throw away the last evidence that she had once been someone with a vision of her own. She pulled out of the driveway without looking back at the house because looking back would have required a kind of courage she did not yet possess. 4 hours north. The Virginia Piedmont flattened, then rose the Blue Ridge, assembling itself on the horizon like a wall. Highways became county roads. County roads became gravel. Gravel became a rutted track through overgrown brush branches, scraping the sedan's sides like fingernails. She almost missed the turnoff entirely. A wooden sign faded to near illegibility. Lawson property, no trespassing. The irony was precise enough to draw blood. Lawson, his name, on her land. And the accusation of trespassing, as if she hadn't been trespassing in her own life for 40 years, tiptoeing through a house that bore his name, living a story he authored, occupying space he considered his. No more. The cabin appeared through the trees like a confession the forest had been keeping. 800 square feet of structural apology logs splitting at the seams. A porch collapsed on one side, where the support beam had rotted through windows, broken out in patterns that suggested both weather and vandalism. The roof sagged in the middle, a visible frown. Moss and Virginia creeper had consumed the north-facing wall entirely, the vegetation so thick it was unclear where the building ended and the mountain began. The place looked like something that had tried to die and failed, settling instead into a slow, undignified decomposition. Margaret sat in the car with the engine off. Silence moved in like a physical presence. No traffic, no neighbors, no lawnmowers or television, or the ambient hum of a life maintained for someone else's comfort. Just wind in bare trees, a crow calling from somewhere on the ridge, and the ticking of the engine cooling. After 3 months of courtrooms and lawyers' offices, and the particular humiliation of having her life appraised and found insufficient, the silence felt like the first merciful thing the world had offered her. She thought about Nathan's spare room, the fresh sheets, Sarah's voice in the background scheduling around the inconvenience of a discarded mother-in-law. She thought about the scratch on the kitchen counter. She thought about Douglas's laugh in the courthouse, the smile he shared with his attorney, the way he had given her this place, this spectacular ruin, with the casual cruelty of a man tossing a bone to a dog he was tired of feeding. "He won't see me fall." The words came out loud, directed at no one and everyone, at the empty car and the empty cabin and the empty years ahead. She opened the door. Mountain air hit her face like a slap, cold sharp laced with pine resin and wood smoke from some distant chimney. She stepped onto ground that was hers legally, and completely 22 acres of mountain slope that Douglas Lawson had been too arrogant to measure correctly. The porch steps groaned under her weight, but held. The front door was locked, but the frame around the lock had rotted to the consistency of wet cardboard, and a firm push broke it open. The smell rolled out mold animal waste, decades of rain coming through the roof, and sitting in wood until the wood forgot it had ever been dry. The interior was a single large room with a rudimentary kitchen area along one wall, a stone fireplace black with old soot, and a loft accessible by a ladder whose rungs looked like a lawsuit waiting to happen. Dust lay over everything in a thick, undisturbed blanket. The floor was punched through in 3 places, dark holes leading to crawl space below. A bird's nest occupied the light fixture. Mouse droppings lined the baseboards in neat rows like punctuation. It was uninhabitable. It was perfect. Margaret stood in the center of the room and felt something ignite in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but its precursor, the raw material from which hope could eventually be built. Anger. Clean, bright, uncut anger. Not the helpless rage of the courtroom, not the muffled frustration of a woman swallowing her objections for the sake of peace. This was different. This was the anger of a woman who had been told she was worthless and was standing in the wreckage of the final insult, looking around and thinking, fine. Fine. You wanted me to disappear into this. Let's see what I make of it. You all want me to vanish. Watch what vanishing looks like. Night came fast in the mountains. December dark at 5 o'clock, total and unforgiving. Margaret laid her sleeping bag on the cleanest section of floor she could find, which wasn't very clean, and sat with her back against the stone fireplace, her flashlight casting a cone of yellow light that made the shadows deeper. The cold crept in through every crack and broken window, settling into her joints and her bones with the patience of something that intended to stay. She cried. Not standing up, not in defiance. She sat on the filthy floor of a cabin that smelled like decay and failure, and she let the full weight of everything land on her at once. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of meals cooked and floors polished, and children raised and dreams deferred. She had done everything right, or everything she had been told was right. And it had ended here, a 62-year-old woman sitting in the dark in a rotting cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains alone in December, with a sleeping bag and a flashlight, and a wedding ring in her pocket that she couldn't throw away and couldn't put on. Her mother's voice came to her then, not as memory but as something closer to visitation. Ruth Calloway's voice cutting through the self-pity with the efficiency of a woman who had never had time for it. Baby girl, the strongest tree is the one that grows from rock. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Lawson understood what her mother meant. Not because she wanted to, but because for the first time she was standing on rock. Sleep came in fragments. She woke at 3 a.m. to a sound in the walls. Something alive, something small moving behind the boards with the confidence of a tenant who had been here longer than she had. She stared at the ceiling at the holes where stars were visible through the damaged roof. And she thought about Douglas in the house she had maintained, sleeping in the bed she had made, living in the world she had built. And she thought about Sloane, 31, occupying the spaces Margaret had vacated. Probably rearranging the furniture. Probably throwing away the photograph on the mantel from the 30th anniversary dinner. The green silk dress. The steady smile. Margaret closed her eyes and made a decision that was not yet conscious, not yet articulated, but real in the way that tectonic shifts are real, invisible until the earthquake. She would not go back. She would not call Nathan. She would not accept the spare room or the pity or the slow erosion of living as a guest in someone else's house. She would stay here in this ruin, in this insult, and she would make something of it. Not because she knew how, but because the alternative was proving Douglas right. Morning arrived through the holes in the roof shafts of pale December light, falling across the floor like search beams. Margaret unzipped the sleeping bag, stiff, and saw her back, announcing its objections in a language of sharp, specific pains. She set up the camping stove she'd bought at a gas station outside Charlottesville, boiled water, made instant coffee in a paper cup, stepped onto the broken porch with the cup steaming in her hands, and looked out at the Blue Ridge Mountains, stacked behind mountains, ridge after ridge, fading into blue haze, the valley below still pooled with morning fog. It was the most beautiful thing she had seen in months. Not because it was objectively extraordinary, Virginia was full of mountain views, but because no one owned this moment except her. No client dinner to prepare for, no schedule to keep, no house to maintain for someone else's comfort. Just Margaret and the mountains and a cup of bad coffee, and the absolute terrifying freedom of having nothing left to lose. She went back inside, sat on the floor, reached for the tube of architectural drawings on top of her bag, the yellowed paper she had carried from the guest room closet through the divorce and up the mountain. The last surviving evidence of the girl who drew impossible buildings. She unrolled the first sheet. The library with the cantilevered reading room. Every line still precise after 40 years. She ran her fingers over the graphite, feeling the faint grooves where a 20-year-old's hand had pressed hard into the paper, certain of every angle. Then she turned the sheet over. The back was blank, clean white, waiting. Margaret picked up a pencil from the cup of pens she'd packed. And on the back of her abandoned dream, she began to sketch the cabin as it was the cabin as it could be. Which wall to repair first, where the roof needed patching, how the porch could be rebuilt. Her hand shook from cold, from caffeine, from the audacity of what she was doing. But the lines came straight. 40 years without a drafting table, and her hand still remembered. The girl who drew impossible buildings had woken up. She was 62, she was broke. She was sitting on the floor of a ruin in the mountains. But her hand remembered. And this time no one, not Douglas, not a courthouse, not a 31-year-old named Sloan, was going to tell her to stop. The first week was arithmetic. Not the kind taught in classrooms, but the kind that governs survival. How many trash bags fit in the sedan? How far a gallon of water stretches when you are drinking it and cleaning with it and boiling it for coffee? How many hours a 62-year-old body can swing a broom before the muscles in her shoulders lock up and refuse further negotiation? Margaret learned the numbers quickly. 14 bags of debris per day. 3 trips to the dumpster behind the gas station, 40 minutes down the mountain. The sedan riding low springs groaning. 2 blisters per hand, then 4. Then the blisters opened, and the raw skin beneath hardened into something that no longer complained. 8 ibuprofen per day. 1 crying session per night, diminishing in duration. She started with the floor. On her knees with a wire brush and a bucket of bleach water, scrubbing mouse droppings and unidentifiable stains from boards that fought back grain swollen with years of moisture splinters, lifting from the surface like tiny accusations. The knees of her jeans wore through by day 3. She duct taped them and kept going. When the brush hit a section too rotted to clean wood that crumbled under pressure like wet bread, she marked it with a piece of chalk and moved on. The chalk marks multiplied. By the end of the week, the floor looked like a map of a country under siege, white X's scattered across the terrain, each one a problem she did not yet know how to solve. But the debris was gone. The mouse nests, the bird carcasses, the newspapers from 1997, the shattered glass, the indefinable organic matter that had been composting in the corners, all of it bagged and hauled and discarded. The cabin was still broken. The roof still leaked. The walls still wore their coats of black mold. But it was empty, and emptiness was its own form of progress. A cleared stage, a blank page on the back of an old drawing. The town 40 minutes south did not have a name worth remembering, a cluster of buildings along a 2-lane road that had been bypassed by the interstate in the 1980s and left to age in place. One general store that sold everything from ammunition to aspirin. One gas station with a single pump. One diner with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Open when we're here." The population, Margaret would later learn, had dropped from 1,200 to 400 in 2 decades. The young leaving for Roanoke or Richmond or anywhere the economy still had a pulse. The buildings that remained stood with the resigned posture of people waiting in a line that never moves. Earl ran the hardware and building supply store at the end of the main road, a corrugated metal building with a gravel lot and a hand-painted sign that said, "Crenshaw Supplies since his grandfather's time." He was 58, built like a man who had spent 30 years lifting lumber with hands the size of dinner plates, and a voice pitched low enough to vibrate the counter when he spoke. His wife had died 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer, the kind that announces itself like a verdict and executes itself like a sentence. Their son had left for Atlanta before the diagnosis, promising to visiting, once then reducing himself to texts that arrived with decreasing frequency. Earl stayed because staying was what he knew. Though the store was bleeding money and the town was bleeding people, and some mornings he unlocked the front door and wondered why he bothered. Margaret came in on a Tuesday, arms full of industrial cleaner, a respirator mask and a crowbar. Earl rang her up with the neutral efficiency of a man who had stopped being curious about his customers. "That's serious chemistry you're buying. Working on something big. Reclaiming my life." The words left her mouth before the filter could catch them raw and unvarnished, and she watched something shift behind Earl's eyes, recognition maybe. The look of one survivor identifying another. "Well," he said, the crowbar in a bag. "Good luck with that." The mold was its own war fort, room by room, wall by wall, with the respirator pressing red grooves into Margaret's cheeks, and the industrial cleaner burning through her gloves. She sprayed and scrubbed in vertical strokes, moving methodically from ceiling to floor. watching the black colonies retreat under chemical assault. Some sections surrendered easily surface mold that lifted like paint. Others had penetrated deep into the grain, the wood stained black all the way through, and no amount of scrubbing could reach the root. Those sections she marked with chalk like the floor. More X's. More problems deferred. She called Claire on day 10, standing on the porch in the cold because the cabin still smelled like bleach and decay. "Mom, how are you really doing?" Claire's voice carried the particular tension of a daughter who has decided to be honest. "Nathan and I have been talking. We think you should come back. Mom, this isn't sustainable." "It's not supposed to be sustainable, it's supposed to be mine." The silence on the line lasted 4 seconds. Margaret counted. Then Claire exhaled something between a laugh and a concession, and the conversation moved to safer ground. Claire's work, the kids, the weather in Charlotte. But the sentence hung in the air after Margaret hung up, and she turned it over in her mind, like a stone she had found on the ground, examining its weight and shape. "It's supposed to be mine." She had never said anything like that before. In 40 years of marriage, ownership had always been a shared word, and the sharing had always tilted in one direction. Earl began calling on weekends. Not social calls, diagnostic ones, the way a mechanic checks on an engine he's not sure will start. Margaret would describe the day's problem: a rotted joist, a cracked window frame, a section of wall that seemed to be separating from the cabin's skeleton. And Earl would talk her through it. Patient and specific, a man translating his own 30 years of construction knowledge into instructions a beginner could follow. When the problems exceeded phone consultation, he drove up his truck loaded with whatever materials she needed, often at cost, sometimes below it. He never explained the discounts. She never asked. It was not charity. Earl had his own reasons for showing up. Reasons that had nothing to do with Margaret and everything to do with the fact that his store had a purpose again. His truck had a destination, and his days had a structure that extended beyond opening and closing. A building nobody entered. Margaret needed supplies. Earl needed a reason to sell them. The arrangement was mutual functional and entirely devoid of romance, two people whose lives had been emptied by different forces temporarily filling each other's gaps. The accident happened on a Thursday in week 4. Margaret was on the extension ladder patching a section of roof where the tar paper had disintegrated. The December air was dry and cold, the metal rungs slick with frost she hadn't noticed. Her right foot slipped. Her left hand grabbed for the gutter, which tore free from the fascia like a rotten tooth. She fell 8 feet, landing on her right side on the frozen ground, and the impact drove the air from her lungs with a sound she would later describe as the noise a paper bag makes when you crush it. She lay on the ground for what felt like hours, but was probably 90 seconds staring at the sky, running inventory. Fingers moved, toes moved, head intact. But something in her right side screamed with every breath, a sharp, specific pain that suggested bones doing things they were not designed to do. She crawled to the porch, pulled herself up. Using the railing, managed to retrieve her phone from the kitchen. Called Earl. He arrived in 40 minutes. Drove her to the clinic in town, where a doctor with tired eyes and a stethoscope older than Margaret confirmed 2 bruised ribs, possibly a hairline fracture, and prescribed rest and anti-inflammatories. 10 days minimum, no lifting, no climbing, no bending if you can avoid it. The doctor looked at her with the particular expression of a medical professional who suspects his patient will not follow instructions. "I mean it. Your body isn't 25. I'm aware." 10 days. Margaret lay in the cabin on a foam pad Earl brought from his store, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and stared at the ceiling she could not repair. Every breath was a negotiation with her ribs. Rolling over required planning and commitment. Getting up to use the portable toilet behind the cabin was an expedition that left her sweating and gray-faced. Nathan called on day 2. "Mom, this is enough. Come home. I'll drive up tomorrow." She held the phone against her ear and felt the pull. The gravitational drag of comfort of a heated house and a real bed and people who would take care of her. She could see it. The spare room, the fresh sheets, Sarah's polite tolerance hardening into resentment by week 2, Nathan caught between wife and mother. Margaret shrinking back into the shape of a woman defined by the spaces other people made for her. I fell off a ladder, Nathan. I didn't fall off the earth. Claire sent $2,000 via an app, no message attached. Margaret stared at the notification for a long time. Pride said refuse it. Survival said pride is a luxury you cannot currently afford. She accepted the money and spent it on a proper wood stove installed by Earl, who bolted it to a fireproof platform and ran the chimney pipe through a hole he cut in the roof with the precision of a man who understood that heat was not optional. The stove changed everything, not metaphorically, literally. Heat radiated through the cabin like a living thing, pushing the cold back into the walls, drying the dampness that had been Margaret's constant companion since December. She sat beside it that first evening, palms extended toward the iron, and felt warmth enter her hands and travel up her arms and settle somewhere behind her sternum. A physical comfort so acute it was almost emotional. She could survive this. The cabin could be lived in. The impossible was becoming merely difficult. It was while scrubbing a particularly stubborn section of moldy wall in the kitchen area, 2 weeks after the fall, ribs still aching but functional, that Margaret heard the hollow sound. She had been working her way along the wall with the wire brush, scrubbing in the mechanical rhythm that had become meditative when the brush hit a section that answered differently. Not the dense thud of solid wood, but a resonant empty echo, the sound of a drum. She stopped, knocked with her knuckles, hollow, knocked on the adjacent section, solid, back to the hollow spot. The boards here were subtly different, older, or installed with a different technique, the nails hand-forged rather than machine-cut, the grain running in a direction that didn't match the surrounding wall. The crowbar was leaning against the fireplace where she'd left it, after prying up a rotted floorboard the previous week. She retrieved it, wedged the flat end into a gap between the mismatched boards, and pulled. The wood, weakened by a century of moisture, gave way with a groan and a crack, and Margaret was looking into a space that should not have existed, a cavity behind the wall roughly 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide, running from floor to ceiling. A hidden compartment built with intention, sealed with care, and then forgotten. Her heart was doing something it hadn't done in months, racing with something other than anxiety. She aimed her flashlight into the cavity. At the bottom, resting on a small wooden platform that kept it off the damp ground, was a box. Cedar about the size of a large shoebox, its surface remarkably intact. Cedar resists rot, and insects, whoever had placed this here understood preservation, had planned for the box to outlast the wall that concealed it. Margaret pulled it out, heavier than she expected. She sat on the floor she had scrubbed, the floor she had marked with chalk, the floor that was becoming hers, and opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crumbled at the edges but had protected its contents for over a century, she found 2 things: a bundle of papers and a cloth bag. The papers first. Deeds, old deeds, the handwriting ornate and faded, the paper thick and foxed. The property, this cabin, these 22 acres, had been registered in 1882 as a mineral claim. Specifically a claim on a natural hot spring. Behind the deeds, a journal. Not a ledger or a legal document, but a personal record written in a cramped, urgent hand, the journal of Silas Prescott, the land's original owner. Margaret read slowly, translating the archaic script entry by entry, her pulse climbing with each page. Silas had discovered the spring in 1881, or rather. But that detail came later on a page Margaret had not yet found. The journal recorded water samples carried to Richmond for analysis. Results: mineral content, exceptionally high sulfur and magnesium and trace lithium properties, consistent with therapeutic use. Silas had drawn plans for a bathhouse. He had corresponded with investors. He had sketched a future in which this mountainside would become a destination, a place of healing, a business built on water that the earth offered freely. Then a final entry dated February 1883. Development postponed, cannot continue alone. Will return when circumstances allow. Silas Prescott died that winter. Pneumonia. The journal stopped. The spring continued. The land passed through hands that never opened the wall, never found the box, never knew what they owned. Eventually, it reached Douglas's grandfather, who paid the taxes and forgot the property the way people forget storage units. The cloth bag contained rock samples, minerals presumably from the area around the spring, and a small glass bottle sealed with wax, the liquid inside amber and still. Margaret sat in the cold cabin on the floor she had cleaned, surrounded by walls she had scrubbed, holding a cedar box full of possibility. The property Douglas Lawson had given her as a final humiliation, the punchline to a joke only he found funny, might be sitting on top of a fortune. The irony was so complete it had weight. And Margaret began to laugh then, to cry then, both at once, the sounds indistinguishable echoing off the cabin walls, where Silas Prescott's secret had waited for 140 years, for someone desperate enough to tear the walls apart. That evening she drove to the diner in town, ordered coffee she didn't taste, and opened her laptop on the sticky table by the window where the Wi-Fi signal was strongest. She searched for 3 hours. Natural hot springs, mineral spas, historical preservation, grant funding. What she learned was a landscape of possibility bordered by obstacles. Mineral springs were genuinely valuable spa resorts built around them, generated significant revenue. But development required capital. Environmental studies permits expertise. A 62-year-old woman with bruised ribs and a savings account measured in hundreds, not thousands, could not simply build a spa, unless history helped. Historical properties, she discovered, could qualify for preservation grants, if she could document the spring's significance, Silas's journal. The analysis results, the original development plans, she might access funding designed to protect exactly this kind of site. The path was narrow, but it existed. Earl confirmed what she'd suspected when she showed him the journal the next day, his thick fingers turning the pages with unexpected delicacy. Folks around here know there's warm water somewhere up on that ridge. Kids used to sneak up to a wet spot in the woods back when I was young. But it was always private land, always overgrown, nobody bothered. He looked at her over the journal. You know what this could be worth. Margaret's voice was steady, the steadiest it had been in months. I know it's worth more than anything he kept. January. Margaret, 63. The search for the spring consumed her days. She walked the 22 acres with Silas's journal in one hand and a topographic map in the other, matching his descriptions to terrain that had shifted and grown over 140 years. Ridgelines he referenced had eroded. Trees he named as landmarks had fallen and been consumed by the forest floor. She walked miles day after day looking for signs, unusual vegetation patterns, ground that stayed damp when the surrounding soil was frozen. Anything suggesting thermal activity beneath the surface. She found it on a morning after snow, a clearing she had crossed a dozen times, unremarkable in every previous visit. But today, with 2 inches of snow on the ground, the clearing revealed its secret, a circle roughly 10 feet across, where the snow had melted. Bare earth in a field of white, heat rising from below. Earl had come along that morning, not because Margaret had asked, but because the temperature was 12 degrees, and he had decided without saying so that a woman with recently bruised ribs should not be hiking mountain terrain alone in January. He stood beside her at the edge of the bare circle and said nothing for a long moment. They dug. Earl's shovel bit into the frozen topsoil while Margaret scraped with a hand trowel, protecting her ribs, moving dirt in careful increments. A foot down, moisture. 2 feet water seeping into the hole from below, and it was warm, not hot warm, the temperature of a bath drawn 20 minutes ago. Margaret pulled off her glove and put her hand in the water, and felt the heat move up through her fingers and into her wrist. And she knelt there in the snow, beside a hole in the ground, touching water that had been rising through rock since before Silas Prescott found it, since before anyone built a cabin or filed a deed or hid a box in a wall. Thank you, Silas. I'll finish what you started. The words came quietly, directed at the ground, at the water, at a man dead for 140 years. who had left a map only a desperate person would follow. February brought destruction. A winter storm swept across the Blue Ridge with the indifference of a natural force that does not distinguish between cabins that have been repaired and cabins that have not. Margaret woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of wind tearing at the roof. Not the familiar creaking she had grown accustomed to, but a violent, percussive ripping tar paper and shingles peeling away like skin from a wound. Water poured through the gaps. She scrambled to move her sleeping bag, her laptop, the cedar box dragging everything toward the stone fireplace, the only part of the structure that seemed indifferent to the storm's opinion. Then a crack like a rifle shot, a pine tree 60 feet tall, split at the base by the wind and fell across the porch. The porch she had rebuilt. Boards she had measured and cut and nailed, following Earl's patient instructions, working through the pain in her ribs. The tree crushed it like a foot on a matchbox. By dawn, the storm had passed and the damage was complete. Margaret stood in mud and broken wood and surveyed the result. The roof peeled back in 2 places. The porch destroyed, water pooled on the floor she had scrubbed clean. 2 months of work undone in 6 hours. She sat on the remains of the porch steps, in the mud, under a gray sky that offered no commentary. She pulled out her phone, opened Nathan's contact. Her thumb hovered over the call button. 1 tap and she could say the words, "Come get me." 1 tap and the spare room would materialize, the fresh sheets, the warm house, the slow, comfortable surrender of a woman who tried and failed and came home. She could feel the pull of it like gravity, the seductive logic of quitting, the relief of admitting that 62 was too old, that the mountain was too hard, that Douglas had been right about her after all. She looked at the phone, looked at the cabin, looked at the cedar box visible through the open doorway sitting on the kitchen counter where she had placed it dry and intact. Silas's journal inside, his plans, his unfinished work. He had died before he could build his bathhouse, but he had written, "Will return when circumstances allow." And the confidence of that sentence, the assumption that someone someday would pick up where he left off, struck Margaret with the force of an obligation. She put the phone in her pocket, stood up, began clearing debris. Earl arrived that afternoon. He parked his truck, walked to where Margaret was dragging branches off the ruined porch, and without a word picked up the other end of the pine tree. They worked in silence for 2 hours, cutting the tree into sections with his chainsaw, stacking the wood, clearing the wreckage. When they stopped for coffee, the camping stove still functional, still faithful, Earl finally spoke. Most people would have left. Margaret wrapped both hands around the cup. Most people had somewhere to go. The grant applications went out in March. 3 historical preservation organizations, 1 environmental conservation fund. Margaret wrote each application by hand on her laptop at the diner, cross-referencing Silas's journal. The mineral analysis documents the property deeds, constructing a narrative that connected a 19th century discovery to a 21st century opportunity. She wrote about Silas Prescott's vision. She wrote about the spring. She did not write about her divorce or her ex-husband or the joke that had put her on this land. The applications were about the property, not the person. The first rejection arrived in April. Form letter polite and final. The second in May. The third requested additional documentation, specifically a professional geological survey, confirming the spring's viability and mineral content. Margaret did not have the money for a professional geological survey. A phone call to the cheapest firm she could find quoted $8,000. She had $1,100 in her account. Claire, during their weekly call, mentioned a colleague's husband who taught geology at the University of Virginia. Margaret's pride resisted for 3 days before necessity overruled it. She called the man, Dr. Alan Whitfield, soft-spoken 60, interested in Virginia hydrology, and explained the situation. The journal, the spring, the lack of funds. He drove up on a Saturday in June, spent 4 hours collecting samples and measurements, and agreed to write the geological assessment pro bono. "Publish or perish," he told her with the wry resignation of an academic who had made peace with the system. "A paper on an undocumented thermal spring in the Blue Ridge does more for my career than it costs me in time. The revised application went to the Virginia Historical Preservation Fund in July. Margaret drove to the post office in town, handed the envelope to the clerk, and stood in the parking lot afterward looking at the mountains and allowed herself to want something, not hope-wanting. The distinction mattered. Hope was passive, a wish launched into the dark. Wanting was active, directional, a hand reaching for a thing it intended to grab. The call came in September. Margaret was on a ladder. A different ladder, properly footed, non-negotiable, after the fall, replacing a window frame when her phone buzzed in her back pocket. She climbed down, saw the 804 area code Richmond, and felt her stomach execute the same elevator drop it had performed in her old kitchen 13 months ago when Douglas said, "We need to talk." "Mrs. Lawson, this is Sandra Okafor from the Virginia Historical Preservation Fund. I'm calling about your application." Margaret leaned against the cabin wall, the wall she had scrubbed, the wall behind which Silas's box had waited, and closed her eyes. The grant was approved. Funding for environmental testing, historical designation, and partial support for initial development of the mineral spring site. The committee had been particularly compelled by the Prescott Journal and the Geological Survey. They wanted the project to succeed. They wanted to be part of the story. Margaret sat on the porch rebuilt for the third time, this time with treated lumber and lag bolts. This time built to survive, and the tears came without permission and without apology. The kind of crying that cleans rather than wounds, that empties rather than fills. She called Nathan first. Then Claire, conference call, both of them on the line at once for the first time since the divorce. "I did it. The grant came through. It's happening." Nathan, the pragmatist, the man who had calculated her odds and found them insufficient. "Mom, you're serious. Dead serious." Claire, quieter. "Mom, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of me too." And that sentence, plain and undecorated, was the most revolutionary thing Margaret Lawson had ever said, because in 63 years she had never once directed that word at herself. Proud had always been something she felt about her children, about Douglas's deals, about other people's accomplishments. Turning it inward, pointing it at her own chest, felt like learning a new language at an age when people told you new languages were no longer possible. The grant unlocked everything that followed. Engineers to study the spring's flow rate and temperature consistency. An architect to review Margaret's bathhouse design, her design drawn on the backs of her old architectural sketches. The cantilevered reading room sharing paper with floor plans for soaking rooms and changing areas. The architect, a woman from Roanoke named Julia, had studied Margaret's drawings with the careful attention of a professional evaluating a peer and pronounced them structurally sound with minor modifications. "You trained as an architect?" Margaret nodded. 40 years ago, before I became a footnote in someone else's career. Contractors arrived. The cabin's transformation accelerated proper insulation, plumbing, electricity that did not flicker during storms. The wood floors were sanded and sealed. Damaged logs replaced, the walls stripped and treated and sealed against moisture. Margaret worked alongside the crew every day, not supervising but laboring, carrying lumber, mixing mortar, learning to operate tools she had only seen in YouTube tutorials months ago. Her hands, already calloused from months of solo work, developed new textures, new competencies. She could identify wood species by grain. She could assess a joint's integrity by touch. She was building her own house, and every nail driven was a word in a sentence she had been waiting 63 years to write. The bathhouse went up beside the cabin through the fall. A small structure designed to echo Silas Prescott's original plans. 3 private soaking rooms, a changing area, a reception space built with modern materials but historical proportions. Water testing confirmed what Silas's journal had claimed, and Dr. Whitfield's survey had documented the mineral content was exceptional: sulfur and magnesium and lithium, in concentrations that placed it among the most therapeutically significant springs in the mid-Atlantic region. When the cabin renovation was complete, Margaret stood before the front door, rebuilt, reinforced, hung on proper hinges, and carved into the header beam. with a chisel she had learned to sharpen herself. The letters were not elegant, not the precise graphite lines of her architectural drawings, but they were deep and they were permanent. The strongest tree is the one that grows from rock. Her mother's words, finally understood, finally earned, cut into the wood of the house her mother's daughter had rebuilt. The moment should have been pure. It nearly was. But in October, with the bathhouse weeks from completion and the historical designation application pending, Margaret opened her mailbox at the post office in town and found a letter from a law firm in Richmond, Douglas's law firm. The letterhead was expensive. The language was precise. Mr. Douglas Lawson, through counsel, was formally requesting a review of the divorce settlement, citing material misrepresentation of asset value at the time of property division. Specifically, the cabin property deeded to Mrs. Lawson as a zero-value asset had since been determined to possess significant commercial potential. Mr. Lawson believed he was entitled to a proportional share of the property's current and future value. Margaret read the letter twice. The first time with her eyes, the second time with her stomach, which clenched around the words the way a fist clenches around a threat. She had spent 14 months rebuilding the cabin, the land herself. She had fallen off a ladder and gotten back up. She had survived a storm that destroyed her work and started over. She had written grant applications and been rejected and revised and been accepted. She had designed a bathhouse with skills she'd buried for 4 decades. And now, from 200 miles away from the comfortable ruins of his own choices, Douglas was reaching for what she had built. Her lawyer hired with grant funds. Her first paid attorney, a woman named Grace who practiced in Roanoke and specialized in property disputes, reviewed the letter and the original divorce decree. The deed was transferred voluntarily. The property was assessed at zero value by his own legal team. He signed the transfer. You signed the acceptance. The divorce is final. He has no legal standing to reopen the settlement. Grace paused. He's bluffing. He's hoping you'll be scared enough to negotiate. Margaret folded the letter and put it in the cedar box beside Silas Prescott's journal. 2 men separated by 140 years, both trying to determine what happened to this land. One had dreamed of building something. The other was trying to take it away. She was not scared, but she was resolved, and the resolution was different from the clean fury she had felt that first night in the cabin. This resolve was cold architectural load-bearing. It did not burn. It built. Every nail she drove for the rest of that month carried the weight of a woman constructing a reality so solid that no lawyer's letter could dismantle it. The spa opened on a Tuesday in March, which Margaret later thought was fitting. Because Tuesdays are the most ordinary of days, the day of the week that carries no mythology, no cultural weight, no expectation of significance. Extraordinary things should begin on ordinary days. It reminds you that transformation is not an event. It is a Tuesday. 3 soaking rooms, each lined with locally quarried stone, each fed by the thermal spring through a system of copper pipes that Dr. Whitfield had helped design and Earl had helped install. A changing area with cedar benches and hooks forged by a blacksmith 2 towns over. A small reception room where Margaret had placed Silas Prescott's original bathhouse drawings in a simple frame on the wall. His cramped handwriting visible behind glass. His vision finally materialized 141 years late. The historical designation plaque hung beside the front door. Prescott Springs, Virginia Historical Site Estate, 1881. Margaret hired 2 people from town. Helen, a retired school teacher who needed supplemental income, and Marcus, a 24-year-old who had been about to leave for Roanoke because there was nothing for him here. She trained them herself, which meant she was learning alongside them. Improvising procedures, writing operational manuals at the kitchen table at midnight, building the airplane while flying it. The first week brought 4 guests. The second brought 11. By the end of the first month, the appointment book was full 3 weeks out, and Margaret stood behind the reception desk on a Friday afternoon watching a couple from Charlottesville emerge from the soaking room with the particular looseness of people whose muscles have forgotten how to hold tension and she felt something she had not felt since before the divorce: competence directed outward. Not the competence of maintaining a household, she had always possessed that, but the competence of creating something that strangers paid money to experience. The distinction was not subtle. One was labor performed for someone who stopped noticing. The other was value recognized by people who chose to come. The impact rippled outward in directions Margaret had not anticipated. The diner in town, which had been operating on the economic equivalent of life support, suddenly had customers who were not locals, spa visitors who needed lunch before or after their appointments, who ordered the daily special, and left tips that exceeded the meal's cost. The gas station, which had been pumping barely enough fuel to justify staying open, now filled tanks for people who had driven hours to reach Prescott Springs. Earl's store, Crenshaw Supply, sold work gloves, local honey, and hand-carved walking sticks that Earl had started making in his workshop, because tourists, it turned out, would buy anything that looked like it came from a mountain. He hired his first employee in 4 years, a woman named Donna, who had been collecting unemployment since the textile plant in the next county closed. Earl stood in his store one Saturday watching Donna ring up a customer who had driven from Richmond specifically to visit the Springs. And his face held an expression Margaret recognized because she had worn it herself in the cabin after the Grant call. The bewildered gratitude of a person discovering that the story they had been telling themselves about their own ending was wrong. "You saved this town, Maggie." "I saved myself. Everything else is spillover." In October, a regional travel magazine sent a writer and a photographer. They spent 2 days at the Springs interviewing Margaret, photographing the cabin and the bathhouse and the Blue Ridge light that turned everything amber at sunset. The article ran in December with a headline, "Margaret did not choose but could not argue with, from divorce to discovery, one woman's mountain miracle." It told the story she had lived: the 40-year marriage, the courthouse, the cabin given as an insult, the hidden compartment, the journal, the spring, the rebuilding. The photograph showed a woman Margaret barely recognized. Gray hair, pulled back skin weathered by 2 years of outdoor labor hands resting on a porch railing she had built 3 times. The woman in the photographs wore jeans and a flannel shirt and boots caked with Virginia clay, and she looked like someone who had constructed something with her own body, not decorative, not invisible, present. The article detonated quietly. Not viral in the modern sense, no single moment of explosion, but a slow, sustained burn that spread through networks Margaret didn't know existed. Women wrote letters, emails arrived through the simple website Helen had helped her build. Women in their 50s and 60s and 70s from Virginia and beyond, who had been divorced or widowed, or simply rendered invisible by a culture that measured female value in units of youth. They shared their stories with the rawness of people who had been waiting for someone to tell them it was acceptable to be angry, acceptable to start over, acceptable to refuse the narrative that said their useful years were behind them. Margaret started a blog because the emails deserved more than individual responses. She called it Rebuilding at 60-something. And she wrote the way she built, without polish, without pretense, with the directness of a woman who had scrubbed mold from walls and dug through frozen ground and fallen off a ladder and gotten back up. She wrote about the physical reality of manual labor at 64, the ibuprofen, the heating pad, the mornings when her knees staged a protest before her feet hit the floor. She wrote about loneliness, the kind that lives in mountain silence, the kind that sits beside you at dinner when the only plate on the table is yours. She wrote about money, about the mathematics of building a business on a shoestring, about the particular terror of watching your bank account approach zero and trusting that it would refill before it emptied completely. And she wrote about Douglas. Not with venom, she had burned through venom in the first year, but with a clarity that was more devastating than anger. She wrote about the day he told her she was invisible, and about the realization months later that he had been right, but not in the way he intended. She had been invisible to herself. For 40 years she had seen herself only as reflected in his approval, his needs, his assessment of her worth. Removing him from the equation had not diminished her. It had revealed her. The greatest gift of divorce wasn't the cabin or the spring. It was learning that she had been carrying her own light the entire time, illuminating everyone around her, never once turning the beam inward. The blog found its audience the way water finds a channel, naturally, inevitably following the path of greatest need. Thousands of followers within months. A community assembled in the comments section, women supporting women through the specific architecture of late life reinvention. Margaret read every comment, responded to as many as she could. She had not set out to build a movement. She had set out to survive. But survival, it turned out, was contagious. Patricia arrived on a Thursday afternoon in spring, without an appointment. 71 years old, silver-haired, dressed in a wool coat that had been expensive a decade ago, standing in the reception area with the tentative posture of a woman entering a church she is not sure will welcome her. She had driven 3 hours from Northern Virginia after reading the magazine article. She was not there for the mineral baths. "I lost my husband 8 months ago, 50 years of marriage, heart attack, in the kitchen. I held him on the floor until the ambulance came, but I knew, and now I—" Her voice broke not dramatically, but the way a branch breaks under accumulated snow, slowly, then all at once. "I don't know who I am without him. 50 years of being his wife. Now I'm just nobody." Margaret led her to the porch, made tea, sat beside her in the wooden chairs that Earl had built from reclaimed barn wood, looking out at the mountains where spring was happening in slow motion. Dogwoods blooming white against the dark ridgeline redbuds like smoke in the understory. "You're not nobody. You're someone who gave 50 years to a partnership. That's extraordinary. But you're also someone separate with instincts and abilities and curiosities that have been waiting for you to pay attention to them. It's not too late to find out what they are." Margaret paused, watching the dogwoods. "I started at 62. You're ahead of schedule." Patricia left with mascara tracks on her cheeks and a handshake that turned into an embrace that lasted longer than either of them expected. The visit would have been a private moment between two women on a porch, except that a guest, a blogger from Roanoke, who had come for the baths, overheard the conversation and wrote about it. The post circulated through channels Margaret would never see, shared by women who recognized themselves in Patricia's confession and in Margaret's response. More visitors came. More letters. More women standing in the reception area looking for something the mineral water could not provide. November. Margaret, 65. 3 years since the courthouse. The rental car struggled up the mountain road, its suspension designed for airport to hotel routes, not the rutted track to Prescott Springs. Margaret was outside with the contractor reviewing drainage plans for the expanded parking area that the partnership would fund when she saw the vehicle lurching toward the property. She recognized the driving style before she recognized the car. Tentative, slightly too fast on the curves. The steering corrections of a man accustomed to paved surfaces and valet parking. Douglas got out looking like a rough draft of the man she had married. Thinner, the weight loss concentrated in his face, sharpening his jaw into something gaunt rather than handsome. His hair had gone fully gray, no more salon visits to maintain the distinguished salt and pepper that Sloane had presumably admired. He wore a sport coat over a polo shirt, the outfit of a man who was no longer sure of his own dress code. His shoes were wrong for the terrain leather soles sliding on gravel. And Margaret noted this with the detached precision of a woman who had learned to read ground conditions the way she once read table settings. He stood 10 feet from the porch and looked at the cabin, at the bathhouse, at the carved header beam, at the property that had been his family's abandoned footnote and was now a functioning business with a historical plaque and a parking area that needed expanding. The shock on his face was genuine and total, the expression of a man confronting evidence that his understanding of the world contained a fundamental error. Maggie. Douglas. They had not spoken directly since the divorce. 3 years of silence bridged only by a lawyer's letter she had filed in the cedar box and a legal motion her attorney had swatted away like a fly. The air between them was heavy with everything unsaid, and everything said too late. His mouth opened with the rehearsed cadence of a man who had practiced his argument in the car.
My attorneys believe that since the property was materially misvalued at the time of stop.
He stopped. She watched the prepared speech dissolve in his mouth, watched his jaw work around words he was not going to deliver, and she waited. The contractor had moved tactfully to the far side of the parking area. The mountains held their usual silence. When Douglas spoke again, his voice was different, lower, stripped of the deal-making rhythm carrying the particular weight of a man who has run out of positions to negotiate from. I know what the lawyers say. I know what I'm supposed to ask for. But that's not. He looked at his shoes, at the gravel, at the ground that belonged to her. Maggie, I was wrong. Not just about the property, about everything. 40 years and I treated you like a service I'd subscribed to. When the subscription got old, I cancelled it. That's not, I don't have a word for what that is. Margaret studied him the way she had learned to study walls, looking for structural integrity, for cracks, for the places where the surface presentation diverged from the underlying truth. She saw calculation in his visit, the residual instinct of a man who had spent his life leveraging situations. But she also saw something beneath it, something the calculation was trying to manage but couldn't fully contain: exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a man who has dismantled his own life and cannot find the manual for reassembly. I accept the apology, but I don't need it anymore. I let go of this a long time ago, not because you deserved forgiveness, but because carrying it was costing me more than you were worth. She let the sentence land. As for the property, the divorce is final. The deed is mine. Whatever this place is worth, it's worth that because of what I did. You contributed nothing except contempt. Douglas looked at the header beam, read the carved words, looked at Margaret. You built all of this. Yes. His voice broke on the next sentence, and the breaking was not performed, not calculated, not part of any strategy. It was the sound of a man arriving at a truth he could not negotiate away from. 40 years, and I never knew who you were. Neither did I, now I do. Help yourself, Doug, the way I had to. She turned and walked toward the contractor, who had found something fascinating about the drainage plans. She heard the rental car's engine start, heard gravel crunch under wrong shoes, heard the vehicle retreat down the mountain. She did not watch him leave. Not from anger, from completion. He was a chapter she had finished reading, and the book she was writing now did not include him. That evening, the porch, the wine, the mountains turning colors. The English language has not adequately named. Not purple, not gold, not amber, but the specific pigment that exists only when Blue Ridge light passes through autumn atmosphere at the angle that occurs for 20 minutes each day in November. Margaret sat in it and felt the last tumbler of a lock click into place. Closure was not a moment, it was an accumulation. Each thing she had built, each wall she had repaired, each grant she had written, and rejection she had survived each morning. She had chosen to stay. They had been assembling themselves into a structure stronger than any cabin, and tonight she was standing inside it. Spring, Margaret 66. Two things arrived simultaneously, as consequential things often do, carrying no sense of their own significance. The first was news from Richmond. Douglas had filed for bankruptcy. He was selling the house Margaret had maintained for 40 years, the house with the scratch on the kitchen counter, where Nathan had dragged a toy truck, the house where Claire had played Bach at age 9. Margaret felt a brief specific sadness, not for Douglas, but for the loss of the physical record of her own history. Then the sadness passed, replaced by something lighter. That house had been a beautiful cage. She did not want it back. The second was an offer, a resort development company, the kind that transforms regional properties into destinations with brand identities and loyalty programs and spas, where the treatments have names borrowed from dead languages, contacted Margaret through her website. They proposed purchasing the entire 22 acres for a figure that Margaret read 3 times because the number seemed to contain too many digits. she could sell. The amount would dissolve every financial anxiety she had carried since the courthouse. She could buy a condominium in Richmond near the grandchildren. She could stop working. Her back, which had been sending increasingly formal complaints since the fall from the ladder, would thank her. Her knees, which had started every morning for 4 years with a sound like someone stepping on bubble wrap, would weep with gratitude. And she was tired. Not the temporary fatigue that sleep resolves, but the deep tissue weariness of a 66-year-old body that had been operating at construction labor intensity for 4 years. Some mornings she sat on the edge of the bed and inventoried her pains: lower, back, right knee, left shoulder. The ribs that had never fully forgiven the ladder, and the inventory took longer than it should have, and each item on the list whispered the same question. Haven't you proved enough? She carried the offer in her coat pocket for 3 days, taking it out and reading it the way she used to take out the wedding ring, examining a decision she was not ready to make. Earl found her on the third day, sitting on the porch with the letter in her lap, and the look of someone trying to solve an equation with too many variables. You're going to sell. It was not a question, and the flatness in his voice carried the weight of a man who had already begun calculating the consequences. The spa closing the visitors, stopping the town resuming its slow deflation. His store returning to the silence he had been preparing to accept 3 years ago when Margaret walked in buying industrial cleaner and crowbars. I don't know, Earl. I'm tired. I'm 66. The money it's enough. It's more than enough. He was quiet for a long time. 3 years ago, I was going to lock that store and drive to Atlanta and spend whatever years I had left sitting in my son's guest room watching television. You know why I stayed. He didn't wait for her answer. Because a woman walked into my store and bought a respirator and a crowbar and told me she was reclaiming her life. And I thought maybe I should try that too. He looked at the bathhouse at the parking area where 3 cars sat at the town, visible in the valley below, small, but no longer shrinking. I'm not telling you to stay. I'm telling you what you built. It's bigger than a spa, Maggie. Margaret did not sell. She called the resort company back and proposed what Grace, her attorney, had drafted: a partnership. The company would invest capital for expansion, additional soaking rooms, upgraded facilities, a small lodging component. In exchange, they received a minority stake. Margaret retained majority ownership, creative control, and the right to operate Prescott Springs according to the historical character she had established. She also hired a general manager, a woman from Roanoke, who had run hotel operations for 20 years, because Margaret had learned finally that strength was not the same thing as refusing help. You could be the strongest tree on the mountain and still let the wind carry your seeds. During the expansion, construction workers removed a section of the original cabin wall that Margaret had not previously disturbed, an interior partition between the kitchen and what had been a pantry. Between the studs wedged into a gap where the old lath met the framing, a single sheet of paper fluttered to the ground. One of the workers handed it to Margaret, assuming it was debris. It was not debris. It was a page from Silas Prescott's journal, separated from the bound volume, likely fallen when the box was placed in the hidden compartment 140 years ago, lodged in the wall's anatomy, like a secret the house had been saving. The handwriting was Silas's, the date, October 1882. Margaret read it, standing in construction dust with her hard hat pushed back on her head, and her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Martha found the spring. She saw steam rising from the ground on a cold morning when she was gathering herbs along the North Ridge. I only dug. I filed the papers in my name because the law does not permit a woman to hold mineral rights in this territory. But the spring is Martha's. It was always Martha's. Everything good in my life has been Martha's, and I have written my name on all of it, and she has never once complained. I wonder sometimes if she knows what she has given me. I wonder if I have ever told her. Margaret read the page twice. Then she sat down on an overturned bucket and let the words settle into her like water into dry ground. Martha Prescott. A woman whose name appeared on no deed, no claim, no legal document associated with this property, had been the one who discovered the spring. She had seen the steam. She had known the ground was warm. She had told her husband, and her husband had filed the papers because that was how things worked in 1882. And Martha had never complained. And Silas had written his name on her discovery. And 140 years later, the pattern had repeated itself in a different key, Margaret, whose 40 years of labor had been weighed against a zero standing on land that a man had discarded because he could not see its worth. But the pattern had broken. For the first time, the woman who found the treasure was also the woman whose name was on the deed. Margaret Lawson, not Douglas, not Silas. The woman who dug with her own hands, who scrubbed the walls, who fell off the ladder, who survived the storm, who wrote the grants and designed the bathhouse, and carved her mother's words into the heather beam. The woman whose name belonged here. She placed the page in the cedar box beside Silas's journal, beside Douglas's lawyer's letter, beside the old deeds and the wax-sealed bottle. The box was becoming an archive of the property's emotional history. The dreams and the threats and the revelations layered like geological strata, each one adding depth to the ground she stood on. Margaret's 67th birthday fell on a Saturday. The spa had expanded into a modest retreat, 8 employees from the local community booking solid through the following year. A historical designation that brought visitors interested in the property's story as much as its mineral water. She had become the most significant employer in a town that had been preparing to die. And the irony of that, a woman discarded as valueless becoming the economic engine of an entire community, was not lost on her, though she wore it lightly. That fall, an invitation arrived from a conference for female entrepreneurs over 50 to be held in Richmond. They wanted Margaret to deliver the keynote address. In Richmond, the city where she had once been a woman who selected ties and arranged table settings and disappeared into the background of her husband's career. The city where a judge had deemed 5 years of alimony sufficient time for a 62-year-old discarded wife to find her footing. Margaret accepted. The conference hall held 400 women. Margaret stood at the podium in jeans and a blazer she'd bought for the occasion. The blazer felt foreign on her shoulders after years of flannel. But she figured the women in the audience deserved to see someone who looked like she'd built something with her own hands, not someone playing a costume. She gripped the podium the way she gripped the porch railing on difficult mornings, for steadiness, not for safety. And she began. I'm 67 years old. When I was 62, my husband of 40 years told me I was invisible. When I was 62, I lost everything I thought defined me: the house, the marriage, the identity I'd spent 4 decades constructing around another person's needs. When I was 62, I believed my life was over. I was wrong about all of it. She paused. 400 faces looked back at her, and in them she saw every version of herself. The woman in the courtroom, the woman on the cabin floor, the woman on the ladder, the woman in the storm. I rebuilt a cabin. I started a business. I found a treasure hidden in a wall. But I want to tell you about a different treasure, one I found just a few months ago. A page from a journal written in 1882 by a man named Silas Prescott. Silas owned the land before me. He filed the mineral claim. His name is on every deed. But on that page, in his own handwriting, he confessed something: the spring was not his discovery. His wife Martha found it. She saw steam rising from the ground on a cold morning while gathering herbs. Silas dug the hole. Silas filed the papers, because in 1882 a woman could not hold mineral rights. Martha's name appears on nothing. She found the treasure, and a man wrote his name on it. Margaret let the silence hold. I spent 40 years in a marriage where my labor was valued at zero. Martha spent her life on land where her discovery bore someone else's name. That pattern is 140 years old, and it is not finished. But on my property, for the first time, the woman who found the treasure is also the woman whose name is on the deed. I am not saying this to boast. I am saying this because every woman in this room has found something built, something sustained, something discovered, something that bears someone else's name or no name at all. And I am saying, Put your name on it. Refuse to be the footnote. Refuse to be the invisible labor. Martha could not. We can. The applause lasted longer than Margaret was comfortable with, so she stepped away from the podium and stood at the edge of the stage, nodding, waiting for it to end, thinking about Martha Prescott, who had seen steam rising from cold ground and had told her husband, and whose name she had just spoken aloud, in a room full of 400 women who would remember it. Afterward, women lined up. Not for autographs, Margaret would have laughed at that, but for conversation. They told her their stories. The woman who had left a 30-year marriage at 58 and started a landscaping business. The woman who had been laid off at 60 and gone back to school for nursing. The woman who was 73 and had just published her first novel. Margaret listened to each one, offered what she could, and marveled at the architecture of what they had collectively assembled, a community of women who had refused the narrative that their useful years were behind them. Nathan and Claire came for the birthday weekend. Nathan drove from Richmond with his wife Sarah and 2 kids who immediately vanished into the woods with the confidence of children who believe mountains were built for their entertainment. Claire came from Charlotte alone, quieter than usual, carrying something she didn't unpack until the evening. They sat on the porch after the kids were asleep in the cabin's loft. The loft Margaret had rebuilt with a proper staircase and safety rails, the loft where mice had once been the only residence. Wine. Mountains. Stars assembling over the Blue Ridge with the dense clarity that only exists in places where the nearest street light is 40 minutes away. Claire's question arrived without preamble, the way important questions do. "Mom, do you regret anything?" Margaret turned the wine glass in her hands. Considered the question the way she considered load-bearing walls, carefully aware that the answer had to support weight. "I regret waiting until 62 to start living, but I don't regret starting." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that sounded younger than 38, younger than a woman with a career and a mortgage and a marriage of her own, "I've been talking to David about things I need, things I stopped asking for because it was easier to keep the peace." She paused. "Because of you. Because I watched you. And I realized I was building the same cage, just with newer furniture." Margaret reached over and took her daughter's hand, held it the way she had held Claire's hand on the first day of kindergarten, on the night before prom, on the morning of her wedding. Some grips carry entire histories. Nathan from the other chair, practical as always. "Dad called last week, asked if you're really doing as well as it seems. Tell him I hope he finds his own version of peace." And she meant it fully and without reservation, which was its own kind of freedom. The freedom of a woman who no longer needed another person's failure to validate her success. After they left on Sunday, after the cars disappeared down the mountain, and the cabin returned to its occupied silence, Margaret went outside. The night was cold, late October. Cold, the kind that makes stars sharper and breath visible. She walked past the bathhouse, along the path that led to the spring, to the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the thermal clearing. A tree that had been growing beside warm water for so long, its roots had adapted to the heat, reaching toward the spring rather than away from it. A tree that had literally shaped itself around a source of warmth. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and removed the wedding ring. She had carried it for 5 years. Through the courthouse and the cabin and the mold and the fall and the storm and the grant and the construction and the opening and the article and the blog and Douglas's return and every other station of her transformation, she had never thrown it away. She had never put it back on. It had existed in her pocket the way the past exists in the body, carried unresolved, too heavy to forget and too finished to wear. She knelt at the base of the oak, dug a small hole with her hands. The same hands that had scrubbed walls and swung hammers and carved her mother's words into wood. Placed the ring in the earth, covered it. Not discarded, not kept, returned. 40 years of marriage, not trash, not treasure. A chapter completed. The ground would hold it the way ground holds everything we give it, without judgment, without memory, without the need to assign value. The ring would become mineral. The mineral would feed the oak. the oak would keep growing toward warmth. Margaret stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and walked back to the cabin. Paused at the front door. Touched the carved words on the header beam, her mother's words running her fingertips over the grooves she had cut herself. Looked at the bathhouse, the parking area, the mountains, the property that a dead man had dreamed about and a living woman had built. She stepped inside and closed the door. The door she had rebuilt hung on hinges she had installed in a frame she had squared herself. Tomorrow she would wake at dawn and start another day. She would check the spring's flow rate and review next month's bookings and answer emails from women who were considering leaving, and women who had already left, and women who had not yet realized they needed to. She would drive to Earl's store and drink bad coffee and argue about lumber grades. She would continue building because building was what she did now, and she intended to do it for as long as her hands could hold a pencil, and her back could hold her upright, and the spring could hold its heat. "Thank you, Doug," she whispered into the quiet of the cabin she had rebuilt from ruin, "for underestimating me." The spring still flowed, and so did she.